He rose into the sky, where the fate of each day was decided, and returned with results that did not fit into familiar stories. The name of Grigory Rechkalov is almost never heard at parades or in school lessons, yet his score is astonishing. Why do some names become legend, while others dissolve in the silence of archives? This story contains lost pages, disputed reports, strange disciplinary decisions, and a clash of characters where sparks flew not only in the air. There are episodes people preferred not to mention aloud, victories credited to the wrong men, and decisions after which a career could collapse in a single day. We will walk the path from Siberian childhood to the cockpit of a fighter where every second weighed like destiny, and in the end, you will discover what was hidden in the gaps of his biography, why one of the best pilots of the country remained in the shadows, and who truly won their invisible duel. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Grigory Andreevich Rechkalov was born on the 9th of February 1920 in the Siberian village of Kudyakovo into a peasant family where survival required endurance and discipline. Siberia shaped him with long winters and brief, intense summers, teaching that mistakes could be fatal and attention to detail meant life itself. From childhood, he observed the sky, not as a dream of flight, but as a guide to weather and seasons. These habits of observation later became instincts in combat. As aviation spread across the Soviet Union, even to remote regions, the local aero club offered him a chance to learn more than village life. Rechkalov approached flight training with patience and method. His instructors quickly noticed his natural spatial awareness and intuitive control of aircraft. Yet talent was only part of the path. The program demanded political reliability, stamina, and mental toughness. Unlike impulsive peers, he was methodical and cautious, qualities that helped him succeed where many failed. By the late 1930s, as Europe moved toward war, Rechkalov had already transformed from a Siberian farm boy into a trained aviator ready to meet the challenges of modern air combat. June 22, 1941. The date that shattered illusions and thrust the Soviet Union into the most devastating conflict in human history. When German aircraft crossed the border in the pre-dawn darkness, they found Soviet aviation largely unprepared for the sophisticated tactics and advanced technology of the Luftwaffe. For pilots like Grigory Rechkalov, the war began not with heroic charges into enemy formations, but with desperate attempts to understand why their aircraft seemed so outmatched, their tactics so inadequate. On July 26, 1941, during a combat sortie, Lieutenant Rechkalov was part of an I-16 escort flying with I-153s. Near Dubasari, when the aircraft approached their target, they came under anti-aircraft fire, and Rechkalov was wounded in the right leg. This early encounter taught him lessons that would influence his entire combat career. The enemy was prepared, professional, and equipped with weapons that could kill Soviet pilots who approached combat with outdated methods. The first months of the war revealed the catastrophic gap between Soviet aviation theory and German combat reality. Pilots who had trained on obsolete tactics found themselves flying obsolete aircraft against enemies who had perfected their skills during campaigns in Poland, France, and Britain. The learning curve was steep, and many promising aviators paid for their education with their lives. Rechkalov's natural caution served him well during this chaotic period. While more aggressive pilots threw themselves into hopeless attacks, he studied enemy behavior, analyzed successful engagements, and gradually developed the systematic approach to combat that would characterize his entire career. He understood that survival required more than courage. It demanded intelligence, patience, and the ability to recognize opportunities when they presented themselves. His early victories came slowly, each one earned through careful planning and precise execution. Unlike pilots who achieved rapid success through lucky encounters or overwhelming numerical advantages, Rechkalov built his reputation through consistent performance under difficult conditions. He learned to work within the limitations of his aircraft, maximizing their strengths while minimizing exposure to enemy advantages. The process was frustrating and dangerous. Soviet fighters of 1941 were generally inferior to their German counterparts in speed, armament, and advanced systems. Pilots had to compensate through superior tactics, better situational awareness, and the kind of combat discipline that could only be developed through repeated exposure to life-threatening situations. Rechkalov proved exceptionally capable of adapting to these harsh realities. His Siberian background had taught him patience and careful observation, qualities that translated directly into combat effectiveness. He learned to wait for the right moment, to position himself advantageously, and to strike with maximum effect when opportunities arose. The character that would define his entire military career began to emerge during these early battles. He was methodical rather than flashy, effective rather than spectacular. While other pilots earned quick recognition through dramatic individual achievements, Rechkalov focused on developing the skills and techniques that would sustain long-term success against increasingly sophisticated enemies. Each combat mission taught him something new about aircraft performance, enemy tactics, or the psychological demands of air-to-air combat. He absorbed these lessons systematically, building a comprehensive understanding of aerial warfare that would eventually make him one of the most effective fighter pilots in the Soviet Air Force. But this methodical approach to professional development also set him apart from pilots who achieved fame through more visible displays of heroism. By 1942, the character of the Eastern Front Air War had fundamentally changed. Both sides had learned from the catastrophic early months of the conflict, and fighter combat had evolved into a sophisticated contest between highly trained pilots flying increasingly advanced aircraft. This was the environment in which Grigory Rechkalov began to demonstrate the full extent of his capabilities as a combat aviator. He sat at the controls of many fighters, but his favorite was the American Airacobra. The Bell Airacobra represented a fascinating chapter in wartime cooperation between allied nations. American-built fighters, delivered through Lend-Lease programs, provided Soviet pilots with aircraft that possessed characteristics distinctly different from either Soviet or German designs. Rechkalov adapted to the Airacobra with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every aspect of his professional development. The aircraft had unusual features. Its engine was mounted behind the pilot. Its armament centered around a powerful cannon that fired through the propeller hub, and its performance characteristics differed significantly from the fighters he had previously flown. Where other pilots might have found these differences challenging, Rechkalov saw opportunities. Rechkalov became the most successful among the Soviet pilots who fought in the Airacobra. He won more than 40 victories in it. His success with the Airacobra demonstrated something important about his approach to aerial combat. He was not merely a skilled pilot, but a student of aviation technology who could maximize the potential of whatever aircraft he flew. The victories began to accumulate steadily through 1942 and into 1943. Each engagement added to his growing reputation as a pilot who could deliver consistent results under difficult conditions. His combat style emphasized precision over aggression, systematic tactics over individual heroics. He studied his enemies carefully, learning their patterns and preferences, then exploited weaknesses with surgical efficiency. On the 24th of May, 1943, he was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for 12 solo and 2 shared shoot-downs throughout 194 sorties. This recognition marked his emergence as one of the elite Soviet fighter pilots, acknowledged by the highest levels of military leadership for his exceptional combat effectiveness. But even as official recognition arrived, subtle tensions were developing within Soviet aviation units. The fighter pilot community was small enough that individual personalities and competing approaches to leadership created friction between strong-willed aviators. Success bred competition, and competition sometimes evolved into conflict between pilots who might have been natural allies under different circumstances. Rechkalov's methodical approach to combat began to contrast sharply with the more aggressive styles favored by other highly successful pilots. His careful preparation and systematic execution produced excellent results, but they also created an impression of coldness or calculation that some colleagues found difficult to appreciate. He was building a reputation as an effective killer of enemy aircraft, but not necessarily as an inspiring leader of men. Grigory Andreevich holds another record. No other Soviet ace has such a variety of aircraft shot down to his credit. Heinkel 111, Junkers 88, Messerschmitt 109, Focke-Wulf 190. The diversity of his victories demonstrated both his tactical flexibility and his ability to engage different types of enemy aircraft under various combat conditions. This variety reflected something important about Rechkalov's combat philosophy. He did not specialize in particular types of engagements or specific enemy aircraft. Instead, he developed comprehensive skills that allowed him to succeed against whatever targets presented themselves. This adaptability would prove crucial as the war evolved and enemy tactics became increasingly sophisticated. The period from 1942 through 1943 represented the peak of Rechkalov's development as a combat pilot. He was learning to balance individual achievement with unit effectiveness, discovering how to maximize his personal success while contributing to broader military objectives. But these same qualities that made him exceptionally effective also set the stage for conflicts with other strong personalities within Soviet aviation. Within the close-knit world of elite Soviet fighter pilots, success created its own complications. By 1943, several aviators had achieved exceptional records, but their personalities and approaches to leadership often clashed in ways that created lasting tensions. The relationship between Grigory Rechkalov and Alexander Pokrishkin exemplified these conflicts, revealing how even the most successful military units could be undermined by personal rivalries and competing philosophies of command. Grigory Rechkalov, a fellow pilot of Alexander Pokrishkin, found himself working alongside a man whose approach to aviation leadership differed fundamentally from his own methodical style. Pokrishkin was charismatic, aggressive, and politically astute, qualities that made him naturally suited for the kind of public recognition that Soviet propaganda required from its military heroes. The tensions between them reflected deeper issues within Soviet military culture. Pokrishkin almost single-handedly fought to change the obsolete Soviet tactics that were in place in 1941 when the war started. Going against the totalitarian establishment and openly defying the totalitarian-approved combat doctrine almost cost him his career and possibly his life. His willingness to challenge established procedures and his success in doing so created a template for leadership that not all pilots could or wanted to follow. Rechkalov's approach was more cautious, more systematic, and ultimately more sustainable for long-term survival in combat. But these very qualities that made him an exceptional pilot also made him appear less dynamic than commanders who achieved results through dramatic gestures and forceful personality. In a military system that increasingly valued visible leadership over quiet competence, his strengths became perceived weaknesses. Pokrishkin was also an imperious personality, requiring submission by his subordinates, and this led to many conflicts. For a pilot like Rechkalov, who had developed his skills through independent analysis and systematic self-improvement, working under such command created inevitable friction. He was not naturally inclined toward the kind of subordination that Pokrishkin's leadership style demanded. The conflict had professional dimensions that went beyond personality differences. The conflict between Rechkalov and Pokrishkin was that after the war, Rechkalov, working with Central Archive documents, discovered 3 of his planes shot down in 1941 on account of disputed records, suggesting that disputes over combat achievements and official recognition continued long after the war ended. These tensions affected unit cohesion and operational effectiveness in ways that military historians are still examining. Fighter squadrons function most effectively when pilots trust each other completely and subordinate individual ambitions to collective success. When personal rivalries develop between highly skilled aviators, the results can compromise mission effectiveness and endanger lives. Rechkalov found himself in an increasingly difficult position as his combat record continued to improve. His achievements demanded recognition, but his personality and approach to leadership made him less suitable than other pilots for the kind of public prominence that Soviet propaganda required. He was accumulating victories at a rate that placed him among the most successful fighter pilots in the world, but his relationship with command structures was becoming strained. In May 1944, Rechkalov took command over the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, but on the 31st of May, 1944, while leading a formation over Ayashi, 5 Airacobras were lost after he decided to pursue a group of Messerschmitt fighters alone. According to official accounts, Rechkalov was disciplined by his superiors for pursuing the enemy alone rather than offering leadership to his less experienced squadron. This incident revealed the fundamental tension in Rechkalov's military career. His individual skills as a fighter pilot were exceptional, but his approach to command emphasized personal performance over inspirational leadership. In a combat situation where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, he reverted to the solitary tactics that had made him personally successful rather than focusing on unit coordination. The discipline he received highlighted how even the most successful pilots could find their careers damaged by conflicts with military hierarchy. Combat effectiveness alone was not sufficient for advancement in a system that required political awareness and social skills, along with professional competence. Rechkalov's focus on technical excellence had made him an exceptional pilot, but it had not prepared him for the complex interpersonal dynamics of military leadership. Above the Kuban River in 1943, the sky became an arena where the most advanced aircraft of 2 powerful nations fought for control of the airspace that would determine the outcome of major ground battles. This was where Grigory Rechkalov demonstrated the combat skills that would establish his reputation as one of the most effective fighter pilots in the Soviet Air Force, even as the political complexities of his military career continued to develop. The Kuban air battles represented a new phase in the Eastern Front Air War. Both German and Soviet forces had learned from the catastrophic early years of the conflict, and fighter combat had evolved into sophisticated contests between highly trained pilots flying advanced aircraft. This was an environment where individual skill, tactical knowledge, and split-second decision-making determined not just personal survival, but the outcome of battles that could affect thousands of ground troops. Rechkalov's approach to these large-scale air battles reflected his methodical personality and systematic understanding of aerial combat. He studied enemy formations before engaging, identified the most dangerous opponents, and positioned himself to maximize the effectiveness of his attacks while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. This careful preparation allowed him to achieve consistent success even against experienced German pilots flying advanced aircraft. The tactical challenges of combat over the Kuban were extraordinarily complex. German fighter pilots had years of combat experience and flew aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and Focke-Wulf 190 that possessed performance advantages in several key areas. Soviet pilots had to compensate through superior tactics, better coordination, and the kind of combat discipline that could only be developed through repeated exposure to life-threatening situations. In this environment, Rechkalov's preference for systematic rather than spectacular tactics proved exceptionally effective. While other pilots might attempt dramatic individual attacks against enemy formations, he focused on creating opportunities for sustained engagement where his superior marksmanship and aircraft handling skills could be most effective. His combat style emphasized patience, precision, and the ability to maintain situational awareness even during the most chaotic phases of aerial battle. One engagement in particular demonstrated the qualities that made Rechkalov such a formidable opponent. Flying his preferred P-39 Airacobra, he encountered a formation of German fighters that had been attempting to intercept Soviet ground attack aircraft. Rather than immediately engaging the enemy formation, he spent several minutes analyzing their tactics, identifying their leader, and positioning himself for an attack that would maximize the element of surprise. When he finally committed to combat, his attack was devastatingly effective. The centerline cannon of the Airacobra, firing high-explosive rounds through the propeller hub, allowed him to destroy enemy aircraft with short, precise bursts that other fighters would have required sustained fire to achieve. His understanding of the weapon system enabled him to make every shot count, conserving ammunition while maximizing damage to enemy aircraft. The psychological aspects of aerial combat were as important as the technical elements. Fighter pilots faced constant stress from the knowledge that any engagement might be their last, and successful aviators had to develop mental techniques for managing fear while maintaining the aggressive mindset necessary for effective combat. Rechkalov's approach emphasized calm analysis over emotional reaction, allowing him to function effectively even in the most threatening situations. His success in major air battles contributed to a growing reputation among both Soviet and German pilots. Enemy aviators learned to recognize his aircraft and tactics, treating him with the kind of professional respect that elite fighter pilots accorded to worthy opponents. This recognition from enemies often proved more meaningful than official acknowledgement from friendly forces, as it represented judgment by professionals who understood the true difficulty of aerial combat. The victories accumulated through these major battles established Rechkalov among the top-tier Soviet fighter pilots, but they also highlighted the complex relationship between individual achievement and unit effectiveness. His personal success was unquestionable, but his approach to combat and command continued to create tensions with other pilots and military leaders who preferred different methods for achieving similar results. Away from combat, Grigory Rechkalov revealed the complex personality behind his systematic flying style. Colleagues described a man of intense focus and personal discipline whose preparation for missions was exhaustive. He studied weather, enemy tactics, and aircraft performance with methodical thoroughness, treating combat aviation as a technical challenge requiring systematic analysis. This thoroughness, while contributing to his survival and success, created distance between Rechkalov and fellow pilots, who relied more on intuition or camaraderie. His systematic approach was respected, but not always understood by aviators who preferred different methods for managing combat stress. His demanding standards for aircraft maintenance and his focus on technical details sometimes made him appear aloof from the social dynamics that bound other pilots together. While effective for his individual needs, this independence limited his natural suitability for the collaborative leadership that military units required. Rechkalov's interests extended beyond immediate combat applications to aircraft design and engineering principles. His correspondence revealed a man who maintained strong connections to his Siberian origins while developing intellectual curiosity about aviation technology. The tension between individual achievement and group leadership became more apparent as his combat record improved, highlighting his preference for personal excellence over the interpersonal management that effective command demanded. As 1945 arrived and the Third Reich collapsed under the combined weight of Allied advances from both East and West, Grigory Rechkalov could reflect on a combat record that placed him among the most successful fighter pilots in aviation history. He scored over 50 solo shootdowns, with various sources crediting him with between 56 and 61 individual victories, along with additional shared successes. By any measure, this represented exceptional achievement in one of the most dangerous professions ever practiced. But victory carried unexpected complications. As the Soviet Union began the process of transitioning from wartime emergency to peacetime reconstruction, decisions had to be made about which wartime heroes would become permanent symbols of national achievement. The selection process involved factors that went beyond pure combat effectiveness. Political reliability, personal charisma, and suitability for public prominence all influenced how individual achievements were recognized and remembered. Rechkalov's systematic approach to combat and his methodical personality, while contributing directly to his exceptional success as a pilot, made him less suitable for the kind of public role that Soviet propaganda required from its military heroes. The same qualities that had enabled him to survive and thrive in aerial combat also made him appear less dynamic and inspirational than other pilots whose personalities were better matched to peacetime celebrity. The contrast with Alexander Pokrishkin became more apparent as both men transitioned from combat roles to peacetime military positions. Alexander Pokrishkin was second only to Ivan Kozydub in Soviet aerial victories during World War II. But his political awareness and charismatic personality made him a natural choice for prominent peacetime positions that emphasized public relations as much as military competence. Rechkalov's combat achievements were never disputed, but the recognition they received was more limited than his record might have suggested. He had earned the title Hero of the Soviet Union twice, received numerous other decorations, and gained respect from both allies and enemies for his professional competence. Yet somehow, his name became associated more with technical excellence than with the inspirational leadership that Soviet military culture increasingly valued. The transition from combat to peacetime service revealed new challenges that Rechkalov had not anticipated. The skills that made him exceptional in aerial combat did not necessarily translate into success in the complex institutional environment of the post-war Soviet military. His preference for systematic analysis over political maneuvering, his focus on technical competence over social networking, and his independent personality all became potential liabilities rather than assets. Personal relationships that had been strained during the war continued to affect his career prospects. The conflicts with Pokrishkin and other prominent aviators had created lasting impressions that influenced how military leadership viewed his potential for advancement. Combat effectiveness alone was not sufficient for success in an institutional environment where interpersonal skills and political awareness were increasingly important. The psychological adjustment to peacetime also presented challenges. Rechkalov had spent years developing skills and reflexes specifically adapted to life-threatening situations. The constant adrenaline of combat operations, the clear objectives of military missions, and the immediate feedback of success or failure in aerial engagements had created a professional identity that was difficult to maintain in peacetime roles. Recognition of his achievements came primarily from professional sources rather than popular acclaim. Aviation historians and military analysts understood the significance of his combat record, but broader public awareness of his contributions remained limited. This pattern reflected the complex relationship between individual merit and institutional recognition that characterized many aspects of Soviet society. The price of victory included not just the physical and psychological costs of sustained combat, but also the realization that exceptional individual achievement did not guarantee corresponding recognition or career advancement. Rechkalov had given everything to mastering the art of aerial combat, but the skills that made him exceptional in that specialized field did not necessarily serve him well in the broader context of military and social institutions. The transition from combat pilot to peacetime officer presented Grigory Rechkalov with challenges that his wartime training had not prepared him to face. The skills that had made him one of the most effective fighter pilots in the Soviet Air Force proved less applicable to the institutional requirements of post-war military service, where political awareness and social connections often mattered more than technical competence or combat experience. His post-war assignments reflected the complex relationship between individual achievement and institutional advancement that characterized much of Soviet military culture. While his combat record guaranteed continued employment and basic respect, the most prominent positions went to officers whose personalities and political skills were better suited to the requirements of peacetime leadership and public representation. Rechkalov found himself assigned to roles that utilized his technical expertise while limiting his opportunities for high-profile command positions. These assignments allowed him to remain within military aviation, but they also represented a subtle form of professional exile that separated him from the centers of power and influence within the Soviet Air Force hierarchy. The contrast with other wartime aces became more apparent as the years passed. Pilots whose combat records were comparable to his own, but whose personalities were better suited to peacetime requirements, received promotions and recognition that eluded him. This pattern reflected institutional priorities that valued diplomatic skills and political reliability, along with professional competence. His methodical personality, which had served him so well in combat, proved less effective in navigating the complex social and political dynamics of post-war military service. The same independence of thought that had enabled him to develop innovative combat techniques also made him appear less amenable to the collaborative leadership style that peacetime military organizations increasingly required. Personal relationships from the war years continued to influence his career prospects. The tensions with Alexander Pokrishkin and other prominent aviators had created lasting impressions that affected how military leadership viewed his potential for advancement. These conflicts, which might have been forgotten in a different institutional environment, became permanent obstacles to professional progress. The psychological adjustment to peacetime proved challenging for many combat veterans, but Rechkalov faced particular difficulties because his entire adult identity had been built around the specialized demands of aerial combat. The constant learning, the immediate feedback of success or failure, and the clear objectives of military missions had created a professional framework that was difficult to replicate in peacetime roles. His technical expertise remained valuable, and he continued to contribute to Soviet aviation development through various assignments that utilized his detailed understanding of fighter aircraft and combat tactics. These contributions were significant, but they lacked the visibility and recognition that came with more prominent positions in military hierarchy. Financial security was never a serious concern, as his military pension and veteran benefits provided adequate support. But the psychological satisfaction that came from recognition and advancement proved more elusive. He had achieved exceptional success in one of the most demanding professions ever practiced, yet found himself marginalized within the very institution that had benefited from his achievements. The broader cultural changes taking place in Soviet society also affected his position. As the immediate memory of wartime crisis faded, public attention shifted toward peacetime achievements and future aspirations. Combat heroes like Rechkalov, who had been essential during the war, found themselves less relevant to national narratives that emphasized reconstruction and technological progress rather than military prowess. His response to these challenges reflected the same systematic approach that had characterized his combat career. He focused on whatever opportunities were available, maintained his technical competence, and avoided the kind of public complaints that might have further damaged his professional prospects. This disciplined approach helped him navigate difficult circumstances, but it also meant that his frustrations remained largely private. The question of why Grigory Rechkalov never achieved the same level of public recognition as other Soviet fighter aces has generated decades of speculation among aviation historians, military analysts, and veterans who served alongside him during the war. The explanations offered reveal as much about the institutional dynamics of Soviet military culture as they do about Rechkalov's individual circumstances. Grigory Rechkalov, a fellow pilot of Alexander Pokryshkin, flew 452 sorties during the war, took part in 122 aerial combats, and notched up 56 individual shootdowns, according to other accounts, 61, and 5 group shootdowns of enemy aircraft. These statistics place him among the most successful fighter pilots in world history, yet his name remains largely unknown outside specialized military history circles. One persistent theory suggests that Rechkalov's personality made him unsuitable for the kind of public role that Soviet propaganda required from military heroes. His systematic, methodical approach to combat, while exceptionally effective, lacked the dramatic flair that made for compelling public narratives. Where other aces provided colorful stories of individual heroism and inspirational leadership, Rechkalov offered technical competence and consistent results. The relationship with Alexander Pokryshkin remains central to most explanations of Rechkalov's relative obscurity. Professional rivalries between highly successful individuals are common in any competitive field, but within the close-knit world of elite fighter pilots, personal conflicts could have lasting consequences that went far beyond immediate professional relationships. Some historians suggest that institutional politics played a decisive role in determining which wartime heroes would receive lasting recognition. The Soviet system required military figures who could serve as effective symbols of national achievement, and this requirement involved factors that went beyond pure combat effectiveness. Charisma, political reliability, and social skills all influenced how individual achievements were recognized and promoted. Another perspective emphasizes the role of timing in shaping historical recognition. Pokryshkin achieved early prominence through combat successes that occurred during periods when Soviet propaganda needed visible symbols of military recovery. His achievements coincided with turning points in the war that made them particularly suitable for public celebration, while Rechkalov's victories, though equally impressive, occurred during periods when attention was focused elsewhere. The concept of the uncomfortable figure appears frequently in discussions of Rechkalov's historical position. This suggests that his independence of thought and systematic approach to problems made him less amenable to the kind of institutional management that peacetime military organizations required. Officers who questioned established procedures or insisted on technical accuracy over political convenience could find their careers limited regardless of their professional competence. Disputes over combat records have added another layer of complexity to Rechkalov's historical reputation. The conflict between Rechkalov and Pokrishkin was that after the war, Rechkalov, working with Central Archive documents, discovered 3 of his planes shot down in 1941 on account of disputed reporting, suggesting that questions about official recognition and accurate record-keeping continued long after combat ended. These archival investigations revealed broader issues about how combat achievements were documented and verified during wartime conditions. The pressure to maintain morale and provide positive propaganda sometimes resulted in inaccurate or incomplete records that were difficult to correct once they became part of official histories. Pilots who attempted to set the record straight could find themselves viewed as troublemakers rather than advocates for historical accuracy. The international context also influenced how individual Soviet pilots were recognized. During the Cold War period, Western aviation historians had limited access to Soviet military records, and their assessments of individual pilot achievements were often based on incomplete information. This meant that pilots who had received less prominent coverage in Soviet sources remained largely unknown to international audiences. Regional factors may have played a role as well. Rechkalov's Siberian origins and his connection to less politically prominent military units meant that his achievements received less attention from Moscow-based media and propaganda organizations. The centralized nature of Soviet information systems meant that stories from remote regions or less connected units could be overshadowed by narratives that originated closer to centers of political power. Personal characteristics that made Rechkalov an exceptional pilot may have also limited his appeal as a public figure. His preference for technical analysis over emotional rhetoric, his systematic approach to problem solving, and his independent personality were valuable in combat, but less suited to the requirements of public relations and political advancement. The speculation surrounding these issues reflects broader questions about how history selects its heroes and how institutional dynamics influence the recognition of individual achievement. Rechkalov's case demonstrates that exceptional professional competence does not automatically translate into historical prominence, particularly in systems where political and social factors play significant roles in determining recognition. Contemporary veterans and historians who have studied his career emphasize that the questions surrounding his recognition should not overshadow the fundamental fact of his extraordinary achievement as a combat pilot. Whatever the reasons for his relative obscurity, his professional record speaks for itself and places him among the most effective fighter pilots in aviation history. The figure of Grigory Rechkalov occupies a unique position in the cultural memory of Soviet aviation, representing both exceptional individual achievement and the complex dynamics that determine how military heroes are remembered and celebrated. His impact on military culture extends beyond his personal combat record to encompass broader questions about leadership, recognition, and the relationship between individual excellence and institutional priorities. Within professional military aviation circles, Rechkalov's systematic approach to combat has been studied and analyzed as an example of how technical competence and methodical preparation can produce exceptional results even under the most demanding conditions. His combat techniques, particularly his mastery of the P-39 Aerocobra's unique characteristics, have been documented in technical studies that examine the relationship between pilot skill and aircraft performance. Aviation historians have used Rechkalov's career as a case study in the complex factors that determine historical recognition. His exceptional combat record, combined with his relative obscurity in popular culture, illustrates how institutional dynamics, personal relationships, and political considerations can influence how individual achievements are remembered and celebrated. The contrast between Rechkalov and more prominent Soviet aces has become a recurring theme in discussions of Soviet military culture. Academic studies of World War II aviation often use his example to explore questions about leadership styles, the relationship between individual achievement and unit effectiveness, and the role of personality in determining career advancement within military hierarchies. Military memoirs and autobiographies from the World War II period frequently mention Rechkalov, though usually in passing rather than as a central figure. These references typically emphasize his professional competence and combat effectiveness, while noting the tensions that sometimes arose from his methodical personality and independent approach to problem-solving. The technical aspects of his combat career have influenced Soviet and Russian aviation doctrine in subtle but significant ways. His systematic approach to aircraft evaluation and his ability to maximize the performance of foreign-built fighters like the P-39 provided valuable insights that influenced how Soviet aviation integrated Western aircraft and technology during and after the war. Educational materials used in military aviation schools have incorporated lessons from Rechkalov's combat experience, particularly his emphasis on thorough preparation and systematic analysis of enemy tactics. While his name may not be widely known outside professional circles, his methods and techniques have influenced the training of subsequent generations of fighter pilots. The broader cultural impact of figures like Rechkalov extends to questions about how societies choose to remember and celebrate their military heroes. His case illustrates the complex relationship between individual merit and public recognition, raising questions about the criteria used to determine which wartime achievements receive lasting attention and commemoration. Literary works dealing with Soviet aviation have occasionally featured characters based on or inspired by Rechkalov's career. These fictional portrayals typically emphasize the tension between individual excellence and collective responsibility, using his professional focus and systematic approach as examples of different models of military leadership and heroism. The international aviation community has gradually developed greater appreciation for Rechkalov's achievements as access to Soviet military records has improved. Western historians, who previously had limited information about Soviet fighter pilots, have begun to include his combat record in comprehensive studies of World War II aviation, providing more balanced assessments of individual pilot effectiveness across different air forces. Museums and exhibitions dealing with World War II aviation increasingly include information about Rechkalov alongside more famous Soviet aces. These displays typically emphasize his technical competence and combat effectiveness while acknowledging the complexity of factors that influence historical recognition and public memory. The academic study of military leadership has found in Rechkalov's career an example of how different personality types can achieve exceptional results through different approaches to the same professional challenges. His systematic, methodical style provides a counterpoint to more charismatic or aggressive models of military leadership, demonstrating that there are multiple paths to excellence in combat aviation. Research into the psychological aspects of combat flying has used Rechkalov's documented experiences to understand how different pilots manage the extreme stress and constant danger inherent in aerial combat. His methodical approach to risk management and his systematic preparation techniques have been analyzed as examples of effective coping strategies for high-stress military occupations. The paradox of Grigory Rechkalov's historical position becomes most apparent when his documented achievements are compared with his limited recognition in popular culture and public memory. Here was a pilot whose combat record placed him among the most successful fighter aces in aviation history, yet whose name remains largely unknown outside specialized military and historical circles. International comparisons highlight the uniqueness of his situation. Western fighter aces with comparable combat records, pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, or Johnny Johnson, became household names in their respective countries and retained that recognition for decades after the war ended. Their achievements were celebrated in books, films, and public commemorations that ensured their place in popular historical memory. The contrast reveals something significant about how different societies construct and maintain historical narratives about military achievement. In Western democratic societies, individual heroism and personal achievement often became central elements of national war stories. The Soviet system, while certainly celebrating military heroes, operated according to different principles that emphasized collective achievement and institutional loyalty alongside individual excellence. Rechkalov's technical approach to combat, while exceptionally effective, produced fewer of the dramatic individual stories that capture public imagination and generate lasting cultural impact. His victories were achieved through systematic preparation and methodical execution, rather than through the kind of spectacular individual exploits that translate easily into compelling popular narratives. The aircraft he flew also influenced how his achievements were perceived and remembered. His mastery of the American-built P-39 Airacobra demonstrated exceptional skill, but it also meant that his success was associated with foreign technology rather than purely Soviet achievement. In a system that valued self-reliance and national technological superiority, this association may have limited the propaganda value of his accomplishments. Geographic factors played a role as well. Many of Rechkalov's combat successes occurred in relatively remote theaters of operations where media coverage was limited and where the strategic significance of individual engagements received less attention from central authorities. Pilots who achieved comparable results in more visible locations or during more politically significant campaigns often received greater recognition. The timing of his peak performance also affected his historical position. Some of his most impressive achievements occurred during periods when Soviet attention was focused on other fronts, or when broader strategic developments overshadowed individual combat successes. The ebb and flow of public attention during wartime meant that exceptional individual performances could be overshadowed by larger events if they occurred at inopportune moments. Personal relationships within the fighter-pilot community continued to influence his historical reputation long after combat ended. The tensions with prominent figures like Alexander Pokrishkin created lasting impressions that affected how his achievements were interpreted and presented in official histories and memoirs. The institutional memory of the Soviet Air Force preserved detailed records of his combat performance. But this professional recognition did not translate into the kind of public commemoration that creates lasting cultural impact. His achievements were acknowledged within military circles, while remaining largely invisible to broader public awareness. Language barriers and limited international access to Soviet military records meant that Western aviation historians had incomplete information about his achievements for decades after the war ended. This limited international recognition further contributed to his relative obscurity compared with Western aces whose achievements were more widely documented and publicized. The complexity of his personality and career also made him less suitable for simplified heroic narratives that popular culture typically requires. His systematic approach to combat and his methodical personality, while contributing directly to his exceptional effectiveness, were more difficult to dramatize than the more colorful exploits of pilots whose achievements came through different means. Modern efforts to provide more comprehensive assessments of World War II aviation have begun to restore appropriate recognition to figures like Rechkalov. Aviation historians with access to previously classified Soviet records have developed more accurate pictures of individual pilot achievements and have worked to correct historical imbalances that resulted from limited information and political considerations. The digital age has provided new opportunities for preserving and sharing information about previously overlooked military figures. Online databases, historical websites, and digital archives have made it possible for researchers and enthusiasts to access detailed information about pilots like Rechkalov, whose achievements were not widely known in previous generations. In the 21st century, the figure of Grigory Rechkalov has begun to receive the recognition that eluded him during his lifetime and in the immediate post-war decades. Modern Russian media, historical documentaries, and aviation museums have started to include his story alongside those of more famous Soviet aces, providing a more complete picture of Soviet fighter pilot achievements during World War II. Contemporary Russian military culture has shown renewed interest in technical competence and professional excellence as values worthy of celebration alongside traditional heroic narratives. This shift in emphasis has created opportunities for figures like Rechkalov, whose achievements were based on systematic skill and methodical preparation rather than dramatic individual exploits, to receive appropriate recognition for their contributions to military victory. Modern aviation museums in Russia and other former Soviet republics have begun to feature exhibits that highlight the diversity of approaches to fighter pilot excellence during World War II. These displays typically present Rechkalov as an example of how technical mastery and systematic preparation could produce exceptional results, providing visitors with a more nuanced understanding of what made Soviet aviation successful during the conflict. International aviation history has also begun to provide more balanced assessments of individual pilot achievements across different air forces. Western historians with access to previously classified Soviet records have developed more accurate pictures of pilots like Rechkalov, leading to revised estimates of their place in the broader context of World War II fighter aviation. Documentary films and television programs dealing with World War II aviation have occasionally featured Rechkalov's story, though usually as part of broader narratives about Soviet fighter pilots, rather than as the central focus of individual programs. These presentations typically emphasize his technical competence and systematic approach to combat as alternatives to more dramatic models of fighter pilot heroism. The internet has provided new platforms for sharing information about previously overlooked military figures. Aviation enthusiast websites, historical forums, and digital archives have made detailed information about Rechkalov's combat record available to international audiences who previously had no access to such material. Modern Russian military aviation continues to study the techniques and methods developed by World War II pilots like Rechkalov. His systematic approach to aircraft evaluation and his ability to maximize the performance characteristics of different fighter types provide lessons that remain relevant for contemporary pilot training and aircraft development programs. Academic institutions studying military history and aviation development have begun to include Rechkalov's career in comparative studies of fighter pilot effectiveness. These analyses typically use his achievements to explore questions about the relationship between individual skill, aircraft performance, and tactical doctrine in determining combat success. Contemporary discussions of military leadership often reference figures like Rechkalov as examples of how different personality types can achieve exceptional results through different approaches to the same professional challenges. His methodical style provides a counterpoint to more charismatic models of leadership, demonstrating that multiple approaches to military excellence can be equally effective. The ongoing process of historical reassessment has benefited from the availability of archival materials that were classified or inaccessible during the Soviet period. Researchers now have access to detailed combat reports, personal correspondence, and official documents that provide more complete pictures of individual military careers and achievements. Modern commemorative efforts have begun to include previously overlooked figures in memorials and monuments dedicated to World War II veterans. While Rechkalov may never achieve the same level of recognition as more famous Soviet aces, his contributions are increasingly acknowledged in educational materials and public presentations about Soviet military aviation. The broader cultural context of contemporary Russia has created new opportunities for recognizing technical excellence and professional competence as values worthy of celebration. This shift has benefited figures like Rechkalov, whose achievements were based on systematic skill rather than dramatic personality, by providing cultural frameworks that can appreciate different models of heroism and success. International aviation communities have developed greater appreciation for the diversity of approaches to fighter pilot excellence that existed during World War II. This broader perspective has created opportunities for pilots like Rechkalov to receive recognition from international sources that complement domestic acknowledgement of their achievements. The digital preservation of historical records and the development of online databases have made it possible to maintain comprehensive records of military achievements that might otherwise be forgotten. These technological developments provide new possibilities for ensuring that figures like Rechkalov receive appropriate recognition for their contributions to military history. Young people studying military history and aviation development now have access to more complete information about the full range of fighter pilot achievements during World War II. This access provides opportunities for new generations to develop more nuanced understandings of what constituted excellence in combat aviation and how different approaches to the same challenges could produce comparable results. The legacy of Grigory Rechkalov in contemporary times represents both the delayed recognition of exceptional individual achievement and the ongoing evolution of how societies remember and celebrate their military heritage. His story demonstrates that historical recognition can be complex and long delayed, but that exceptional professional competence ultimately finds acknowledgement even when political and social factors initially limit its visibility. In the end, the measure of any fighter pilot's contribution must be found in the precision of his shooting, the wisdom of his tactics, and his ability to survive and prevail in circumstances where split-second decisions determined life or death. By these standards, Grigory Andreevich Rechkalov earned his place among the greatest combat aviators in history, regardless of the recognition that came during his lifetime or the complexities that affected his historical reputation.